Welcome to American Legacies, where we explore incredible stories of the people who shaped the nation. From founders like Benjamin Franklin, to creators like Walt Disney, barrier breakers like Rosa Parks, to stars like Frank Sinatra. Whether they led revolutions, inspired generations, or changed the course of history, their stories are woven into the fabric of America. Join us as we uncover the triumphs, struggles, and legacies of the heroes of our country. Let's get started. George Mason is often considered one of America's forgotten founders, a man whose ideas deeply shaped the nation, even though his name is less famous than peers like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, or James Madison. In his own time, Mason's contemporaries admired his intellect and statesmanship. Virginia Governor Edmund Randolph ranked him behind none of the sons of Virginia in knowledge of her history and interest, noting Mason's ability to see straight to the core of any issue. Historian Ralph Ketcham observes that Mason was widely acknowledged as having the most profound understanding of Republican government of any man in Virginia, to the point that even Jefferson and Madison deferred to him as their mentor on matters of political theory. Yet today, Mason does not share the cultural renown of those men. This paradox is partly because Mason shunned the spotlight and refused high office, preferring the role of a principled architect of liberty over that of a power-seeking politician. He has even been described as a sharp-spoken planter with little patience for fools or political pomp. Small wonder one biographer titled his work, "George Mason, Reluctant Statesman."
He authored the Virginia Declaration of Rights, the first modern Bill of Rights, which became a template for the U.S. Bill of Rights and influenced documents like the Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. Mason was a driving force behind colonial resistance to British tyranny, co-writing the Fairfax Resolves of 1774 and spearheading Virginia's push for independence. Yet he is equally famous for what he refused to do. In 1787, Mason helped draft the United States Constitution but ultimately refused to sign it, declaring he would sooner chop off his right hand than endorse a constitution without a Declaration of Rights. In short, George Mason was a complex figure. A wealthy planter devoted to Enlightenment ideals, a slaveholder who denounced slavery's evils, a friend and mentor to famous founders, yet content to remain in private life.
This episode explores Mason's life and legacy, from his upbringing in colonial Virginia to his pivotal role in America's founding, his relationships with other luminaries, the lesser-known anecdotes that bring his character to life, and the enduring principles he left for posterity. George Mason was born in 1725 in colonial Virginia on a plantation in Fairfax County. He was the eldest child of George Mason III and Anne Thompson Mason, a prosperous family of landowners in Virginia and Maryland. George's early childhood was marked by tragedy. In 1735, when George was just 10 years old, his father drowned in a boating accident on the Potomac River. Young George's mother, Anne, managed the family estates and raised 3 children on her own, a task she handled with notable skill and efficiency by all accounts. To further support the fatherless family, an uncle, John Mercer, took George under his wing. Mercer owned an extensive library of some 1,500 volumes, about 1/3 of them on law, and it was here that George's education truly took root. Largely self-educated, he voraciously read law, history, and Enlightenment philosophy from his uncle's shelves, acquiring a first-rate intellectual training even though he had little formal schooling. In effect, Mercer's library was George's university, and it helped shape him into the deep thinker and self-taught lawyer he would become. George's studious youth imbued him with Enlightenment ideas about government and human rights. One guiding principle he absorbed early was a belief in natural equality. Later in life he wrote, "We came equals into this world, and equals we shall go out of it," a sentiment reflecting his commitment to fundamental human dignity. This ideal would resonate throughout his career in his insistence on individual rights and liberties. At age 21, his life changed dramatically when he inherited his late father's substantial estates. This was around 1746, and the inheritance instantly made him one of the wealthier planters in Virginia. He took charge of thousands of acres of productive farmland in Virginia and Maryland, as well as vast tracts of frontier land yet to be developed. Along with land, George inherited a large enslaved workforce, around 300 enslaved people, was common for a plantation heir in the 18th century. His status as a slaveholding planter stood in stark contrast to his personal moral views. From his youth, he regarded slavery as an abhorrent institution that would ultimately curse the nation. He hated slavery and, like many founding fathers, thought it morally wrong, at times advocating schemes for its gradual abolition with compensation to slaveholders. This internal conflict between ideology and economic reality was one he never fully resolved, as we will see later, but it was already apparent in his early life. With his inheritance, he also assumed the role of a Virginian gentleman of property. He built a home called Gunston Hall on his estate, completing it by 1755 as a grand Georgian mansion overlooking the Potomac. As master of Gunston Hall, he was one of the richest planters in Virginia, well entrenched in the Tidewater elite. However, unlike some of his contemporaries, he did not seek public acclaim or high political office simply due to his status. He was known to value his private life and family above all, and he engaged in public affairs only when duty called or principles were at stake. This temperament would earn him a reputation as a reluctant public servant, content in his own sphere and unwilling to chase power for its own sake. In 1750, 25-year-old George took a major step in his personal life by marrying Anne Ebeck, who was just 16 at the time. Anne Ebeck came from a Maryland family, and their marriage proved fruitful and loving. Over 23 years of marriage, the couple had 9 children, who survived to adulthood, 5 sons and 4 daughters. He was a devoted father, by all accounts, conscientious and deeply involved in raising his children. After Anne died tragically of illness in 1773, he was left a widower with a large family of young children to care for. This responsibility weighed heavily on him. In fact, his love of family and home often deterred him from accepting roles that would take him far from Gunston Hall for long periods. He did not want to be away from his children for long, which he later cited as a key reason for avoiding prolonged public service or travel. George's personal letters and recollections reveal a man who preferred the quiet blessings of a private station to the clamor of politics. He once described himself as someone who seldom meddled in public affairs, content in private life, and indifferent to the smiles and frowns of the great. That is, he did not court the favor of powerful men. This attitude distinguished him from ambitious peers. While contemporaries like Jefferson or John Adams climbed the political ladder to national office, he frequently shunned political office when he could. He even declined opportunities that came his way. For example, after American independence, the Virginia legislature elected him to serve as one of the state's first U.S. senators, but he flatly refused the Senate seat and chose to retire instead. None of this is to say George was a recluse or apathetic, far from it. When he believed fundamental principles were at stake, he became intensely involved in public work. But unlike more fame-seeking founders, he had no personal thirst for political glory. One historian aptly noted that his great contributions earned him a fame that he, unlike other members of his generation, did not crave. This reluctance sometimes cost him the recognition he deserved, both in his lifetime and afterward. But it also burnished his legacy as a man of principle. He engaged in politics not for ambition, but out of a sense of duty to protect the rights and well-being of his community. Despite his private inclinations, George could not remain on the sidelines as the political storms of the 1760s approached. He gradually became a respected local leader, and then a voice in the growing American resistance against British colonial policies. His entry into public service began at the community level. He served as a justice of the peace in Fairfax County, and was a longtime trustee of the new town of Alexandria, from 1754 to 1779. These roles gave him practical experience in local governance and put him in the company of other Virginia gentlemen, including his neighbor, George Washington. In 1759, at the age of 34, he took a significant step into politics when he was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature. Interestingly, his election to the House of Burgesses came through a by-election to fill a vacancy, and he did not serve for long at that time. He briefly filled the seat but resigned after a year or two, likely due to a combination of ill health and his perennial dislike of the political grind. This short stint was an early sign of George's pattern. He would step up when needed, but he had little taste for the ordinary business of legislative life. He once admitted he was bored by legislative routines and committee work. Nonetheless, his time in the House coincided with the tumult of the Stamp Act crisis. When Parliament imposed the infamous Stamp Act in 1765, colonists erupted in protest. George, incensed by this direct taxation without representation, took action by writing an open letter to British merchants in London, explaining the colony's grievances and urging those merchants to help convince Parliament to repeal the act. In doing so, he demonstrated his ability to articulate the American position clearly and rationally to an overseas audience. This letter was one of his first notable political writings, predating the more famous pamphlets of Thomas Jefferson and others. By the late 1760s, he had forged a strong friendship with George Washington, who lived not far away at Mount Vernon. Both men were members of the Virginia gentry and shared concerns about British overreach. In 1769, Washington invited Mason's collaboration on a set of resolutions to resist new British taxes, specifically the townshend duties. Together they drafted the Virginia Non-Importation Resolutions of 1769, which called for a boycott of British goods as a form of economic protest. Washington introduced these resolutions in the House of Burgesses, and Mason's handiwork can be seen throughout the document. The non-importation resolutions not only help unify Virginia planters in a common cause, but they also cemented his role as a key strategist in the colonial resistance. To enforce the boycott, Mason and Washington advocated the creation of local committees to ensure compliance, an early example of the self-organizing American resistance that would later underpin the Revolution. In that same year, Mason sold Washington 100 acres of land to expand the Mount Vernon estate, a transaction reflecting their neighborly ties. As the imperial crisis escalated, George's voice grew louder. He became a member of Virginia's Committee of Correspondence and the Committee of Safety in the early 1770s, bodies that coordinated intercolonial responses to British actions. But his real breakthrough as a revolutionary leader came in 1774. In response to the coercive acts, Britain's punitive measures after the Boston Tea Party, Fairfax County held a public meeting chaired by George Washington, and Mason was tasked with drafting a set of resolutions to express the colony's position. The result was the Fairfax Resolves, a document primarily authored by Mason and adopted on July 18, 1774. These resolves boldly laid out the constitutional grounds of American objections to British policy. For example, the Fairfax Resolves declared that Americans were entitled to the same rights as Englishmen, that they could only be taxed by their own representatives, and that anyone unconstitutionally trying to enslave America would be the enemy of the colony. George even concluded the resolves with a fiery warning. If Britain maintained its oppressive claims, it would establish the most grievous and intolerable tyranny and oppression that ever was inflicted upon mankind. The Fairfax Resolves proved to be one of the most influential county resolves of the Revolutionary crisis. While many Virginia counties penned similar statements, Mason's was the lengthiest and most comprehensive, earning praise as his first great movement on the theater of the Revolution. The resolves not only articulated fundamental principles, like no taxation without representation and the right to self-government, but also called for a Continental Congress, helping pave the way for the First Continental Congress that met later in 1774. It's no exaggeration to say Mason's pen in 1774 helped stir the revolutionary pot and bring the colonies together in common cause. Throughout the American Revolution, George mostly worked at the state and local level rather than join the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, which he was content to leave to others. He served in the Virginia legislature, formerly the House of Burgesses, which became the House of Delegates, and on Virginia's executive councils. However, he also faced recurrent ill health, possibly gout and other ailments, that often kept him at Gunston Hall. Indeed, illness forced him to resign from an important committee to revise Virginia's laws in 1777. Despite these absences, his contributions during the war remained significant in Virginia's governance and military organization. Notably, he supported the disestablishment of the Anglican Church in Virginia, pushing to end the official, tax-supported status of the church, thereby helping to lay a foundation for religious freedom in the state. He also continued to address Western land issues. The pamphlet he'd written in 1773, Extracts from the Virginia Charters, laid out Virginia's claims to Western territory, and its influence can be seen later in the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which set U.S. boundaries at the Great Lakes rather than the Ohio River, aligning with Virginia's old charter claims. By war's end, he had established himself as one of Virginia's key statesmen, respected for his wisdom and writings, even though he never sought national office. In 1776, however, he would achieve his greatest contribution to American history, one that echoed far beyond Virginia's borders. In the spring of 1776, as independence loomed, Virginia called a convention to draft a new state constitution. George, then 50 years old, was appointed to this Virginia convention and asked to draft a Declaration of Rights for the state. The result, adopted June 12, 1776, was the Virginia Declaration of Rights, largely authored by Mason, and it stands as one of the most important documents of the Revolutionary era. In fact, historians have called it the most influential constitutional document in American history. He intended this Declaration of Rights to serve as the preamble to Virginia's new Constitution, laying out the fundamental principles of government and the innate rights of the people. The Virginia Declaration of Rights was a sweeping proclamation of liberty and Republican principles. Its opening lines, drafted by Mason, declared that all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights, namely, the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. This marked one of the first times the familiar trio of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which Thomas Jefferson would echo in the National Declaration of Independence a few weeks later, was codified into a founding document. Mason's declaration went on to assert groundbreaking ideas for its time, including popular sovereignty. All power is derived from the people, and government officials are the people's trustees and servants. Separation of powers. The legislative, executive, and judicial powers should be separate bodies to prevent abuse. Periodic elections and no hereditary office. Government posts are not hereditary. The people have the right to regular, free elections of their representatives. Freedom of the press. The press was described as one of the great bulwarks of liberty and should be free from government restraint. Religious liberty. All men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion, according to their conscience. An early, strong statement of religious freedom. Military subordination. Standing armies in peacetime are dangerous to liberty, and the military must always be under civilian control. Due process rights. Mason enumerated rights of the accused, such as trial by jury, protection against self-incrimination, and bans on excessive bail, cruel and unusual punishments, etc., to ensure justice in criminal prosecutions. Right to reform government. Perhaps most radically, George wrote that if a government turned destructive of the people's welfare, a majority of the community has an indubitable, inalienable, and indefeasible right to reform, alter, or abolish it as needed for the public good. These principles, many drawn from English tradition and Enlightenment thought, were given new weight by his eloquent phrasing in the revolutionary context. Notably, his draft originally included a strong condemnation of the slave trade, but this clause was removed in the final version due to opposition from other delegates who were themselves slave owners, a telling omission that foreshadowed future conflicts. The influence of the Virginia Declaration of Rights was profound and immediate. Mason's document was copied almost verbatim by several other newly independent states in their constitutions, and it directly inspired the Declaration of Independence that Jefferson wrote soon after. Jefferson, a fellow Virginian, drew heavily on Mason's ideas and even some wording. Years later, Mason's declaration would also serve as a model for the U.S. Bill of Rights. James Madison relied on Mason's earlier work when drafting those first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Beyond America, the French revolutionaries consulted Jefferson about Mason's declaration when formulating the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Mason's assertion that all men are born equally free found echoes in that French declaration and many subsequent human rights documents. Even today, the ideals in Mason's 1776 declaration reverberate, One can draw a line from his work to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which enshrines similar fundamental rights. Mason himself regarded the Virginia Declaration of Rights as perhaps his greatest achievement. It was adopted in Williamsburg on June 12, 1776, to much acclaim. 2 weeks later, Virginia's convention used his handiwork as a preamble to the new Virginia Constitution, which Mason also had a large hand in drafting. With this, Virginia, the oldest of the colonies, set a pattern of constitution-making and rights declaration that others would follow. As historian Pauline Maier noted, George was fundamentally a builder, not a naysayer, and the Virginia Declaration of Rights was the clearest example of him building the philosophical framework of American liberty. After the American Revolution, the new nation first operated under the Articles of Confederation, but by the mid-1780s, many, including George Washington and James Madison, felt a stronger federal government was needed. Although he had retired from Virginia politics in the early 1780s out of frustration with factionalism and mismanagement, he was drawn back into the arena for the great task of 1787, the Federal Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. George was selected as a Virginia delegate alongside Washington and Madison, and despite some hesitation, he attended the convention which met from May to September 1787. By this time, he was 61 years old and one of the elder statesmen present, but he proved to be an active and influential participant. In fact, he spoke over 100 times during the debates, making him one of the 5 most frequent speakers at the convention. His contributions were substantial. He brought the perspective of an experienced lawmaker and rights advocate, and he was instrumental in shaping discussions on representation, federal powers, and, notably, the issue of the slave trade. Throughout that summer, George generally supported the creation of a new federal system, but with important reservations. He agreed with many aspects of the draft Constitution, but became increasingly concerned about certain features he believed were flawed or dangerous. One major concern for him was the lack of a specific Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. He assumed such guarantees would be included as they were in state constitutions, like Virginia's. As the convention neared its end, on September 12, 1787, he made a motion to preface the Constitution with a Bill of Rights, even suggesting that one could be drawn up in a few hours using the various state declarations of rights, including his own from 1776, as models. He argued this would give great quiet to the people and secure broad support for the new government. Shockingly to him, not a single delegation voted in favor of adding a Bill of Rights at that late stage. The convention delegates, eager to conclude their work after 4 long months, dismissed Mason's proposal, some reasoning that the state's bills of rights were sufficient, or that enumerating rights could be problematic. Besides the absence of a Bill of Rights, Mason had other objections to the draft Constitution. He thought the new federal government was too powerful and could overwhelm the states. For instance, he felt the House of Representatives was too small to truly represent the people, and he thought the Senate was too elite and potentially aristocratic. He worried that the federal judiciary, as designed, especially the Supreme Court's broad jurisdiction, might destroy the state judiciaries and enable rich litigants to oppress the poor in court. He also strenuously opposed the Constitution's allowance of the slave trade to continue. A slaveholder himself, George nonetheless denounced the slave trade as infernal traffic and warned that tolerating it, even temporarily, was a moral outrage. He believed slavery would corrupt and eventually ruin the Republic, stating in a remarkable speech that slavery would bring the judgment of heaven on a country for national sins. As the convention drew to a close, he found he could not in good conscience put his name on the Constitution as written. In the final days, he teamed up with fellow delegates Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts and Edmund Randolph of Virginia, the same Randolph who had lauded Mason years before, in voicing last-minute objections. When September 17, 1787 arrived, the day the Constitution was signed by the delegates, Mason, Gerry, and Randolph were the only 3 present who refused to sign the document. Mason's refusal was emphatic. He famously declared that he would sooner chop off his right hand than sign a constitution without a Bill of Rights to safeguard the people. This vivid pronouncement, quoted by contemporaries, captured his uncompromising devotion to principle. It also effectively ruined his friendship with George Washington. Washington was bitterly disappointed by Mason's dissent and later wrote to Madison that Mason seemed bent to alarm the people rather than convince by reason. The two neighbors who had worked so closely during the Revolution were estranged by this constitutional dispute. Before leaving Philadelphia, George took one more step that would influence the national debate. He penned a document entitled Objections to this Constitution of Government, outlining point by point the reasons for his refusal to sign. His first and foremost objection was clear and simple: there is no Declaration of Rights. He went on to list other concerns: the structure of Congress, the powers of the judiciary, the ambiguous office of vice president, etc., even warning that the new government might eventually turn into either a monarchy or a corrupt, oppressive aristocracy if checks weren't added. He had several copies of these objections made and privately distributed them to political allies. One copy quickly found its way into the press, becoming a pamphlet that anti-federalists across the states used as ammunition against ratification. He initially hadn't intended to publish his objections so widely, but when it happened, he accepted it as beneficial. He even sent a copy to George Washington, perhaps in a last attempt to persuade his old friend. He did not oppose the idea of a federal union or a constitution per se. In fact, he wanted a better constitution, not no constitution. A contemporary noted that George was not anti-constitutional in principle. Indeed, after the convention, he wrote that his objections are not numerous, but in his mind, some of them are capital ones, meaning fundamental. He was essentially asking for amendments. And in time, he conceded that if a Bill of Rights and a few other changes were made, he could cheerfully put his hand and heart to the new government. But first, he fought to make those changes happen. When the draft Constitution went to the states for ratification, he returned home to Virginia to rally opposition, unless amendments were promised. In June 1788, the Virginia Ratifying Convention met in Richmond, and George, at 62 years old, was a delegate there, determined to prevent unamended ratification. Despite his age and recent long absence from home, he threw himself into the debates with vigor. He was again one of the most active delegates at the convention. He immediately moved that the convention debate the Constitution clause by clause, rather than voting up or down on it as a whole, so that its flaws could be highlighted. This tactical move, however, backfired by allowing Federalist leaders like James Madison and John Marshall to dominate the discussion with calm, clause-by-clause rebuttals, dulling the effect of Patrick Henry's more fiery oratory on the anti-Federalist side. During the Virginia debates, George reprised his concerns. He warned about the taxation powers, fearing, for example, that Congress's power to tax could be unfairly applied to slave property, burdening the South. He vigorously objected to federal control over the state militias, positing a scenario where Congress might neglect the militias to justify raising a standing army, something he considered dangerous to liberty. He attacked the breadth of the federal judiciary, arguing it could easily overshadow state courts and destroy the state governments in practice. In a surprising proposal, he even suggested that ordinary federal legal matters could be left to state judges, to limit the reach of federal judges to only truly national or international issues. But above all, he kept pressing the need for a Declaration of Rights and other necessary amendments. The Virginia Convention was closely divided. Alongside George stood the formidable orator Patrick Henry and Governor Edmund Randolph, who had come around to Mason's view that amendments were needed. Opposing them, advocating ratification, were James Madison, John Marshall, and Governor-in-Waiting Henry Lee, among others, with George Washington's enormous prestige looming in the background. Washington was not at the convention, but everyone knew Virginia's favorite son wanted ratification. In the end, Virginia ratified the Constitution by a narrow vote of 89 to 79. However, this approval came with an understanding, essentially a deal, that the first Congress under the new Constitution would consider a list of amendments, including a Bill of Rights, to address the anti-Federalists' fears. Virginia's convention appended a proposal of a Bill of Rights and other amendments, along with its ratification. His relentless advocacy thus directly contributed to this outcome. The Federalists had to concede the principle that amendments were warranted, James Madison himself, though he had initially argued a Bill of Rights was unnecessary, publicly acknowledged that the Constitution was imperfect and that amendments would be a wise step to allay public concerns. With ratification narrowly secured in Virginia, and in other key states like Massachusetts and New York under similar conditions, the new U.S. government was established in 1789. True to the compromise, James Madison introduced a Bill of Rights in the first Congress that year, drawing heavily on Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, and even wording from his recommended amendments. By December 1791, the first 10 amendments, the U.S. Bill of Rights, were ratified by the states, enshrining freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, the right to bear arms, due process protections, jury trial rights, and more into the Constitution. In doing so, they answered Mason's chief objection. It can be said that his principled stand at Philadelphia and in Virginia was vindicated. The Constitution gained its crucial liberties and limits, largely thanks to the pressure he and the anti-federalists exerted. Mason himself recognized this. Once the Bill of Rights was assured, he reportedly acknowledged that with those amendments, and a few others, like limits on the judiciary, eventually reflected in the 11th Amendment, he could fully support the new government. His goal had never been to tear down the Constitution, but to perfect it in line with the Revolution's ideals. After the intense fight over the Constitution, George finally withdrew from public life for good. Starting in 1789, as George Washington assumed the presidency, he retreated to Gunston Hall. He was often in poor health, suffering from painful gout and other ailments. Though out of office, he did not remain quiet. He continued to be a candid observer and sometimes critic of the new federal government's policies. For instance, he opposed many of the measures of Washington's administration that were championed by Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist Party, such as the National Bank and certain taxes, fearing they favored moneyed interests over the common citizen. By this time, Mason's old friend George Washington was firmly in the Federalist camp, and their earlier friendship never fully recovered. But Mason seems to have held no personal grudge. He was simply steadfast in his principles to the end. In his personal life, he found some happiness in these twilight years. In 1780, a few years after his first wife's death, he remarried, taking Sarah Brent as his second wife. Sarah Brent came from a respected Maryland family. Though much less is recorded about her, it's known that she and George did not have children together. She provided companionship to him in his later years and helped care for his existing family. His grown children from his first marriage also remained close at hand. Several of his sons and daughters settled around him in Virginia. George died on October 7, 1792, at his beloved Gunston Hall, at the age of 66. He was buried on the estate, leaving behind a rich legacy of ideas and writings, but no grand monuments or presidential library, fitting for a man who never sought grandeur. A neighbor noted that he passed away quietly, as if slipping away in the knowledge that he had done his duty to his country. His death came just months after the Bill of Rights was adopted, an outcome he had worked so long to see. One might imagine him in his final days, satisfied that the defects he had protested were now on their way to being fixed, thus securing the liberty for which he had fought. Here are some of the most important takeaways from Mason's life and contributions. His insistence on a written guarantee of fundamental rights directly paved the way for the U.S. Bill of Rights. He wrote America's first Bill of Rights and refused to accept a constitution without one. Every American today enjoys freedoms, speech, religion, jury trial, etc., that George fought to secure. He has rightly been called the father of the Bill of Rights for this legacy, even if the term isn't as widely known as father of the Constitution for Madison. His Virginia Declaration of Rights also helped set a global precedent for enshrining human rights in founding documents. He played a behind-the-scenes mentorship role to other luminaries. Jefferson, Madison, and others drew on his knowledge and looked up to him. He was essentially a teacher of Republican philosophy while remaining a private citizen much of his life. His humility in not coveting fame contributed to his being less remembered. But as a result, Mason's story teaches us about the unsung architects of change, those whose ideas might be adopted by others who get the credit. In Virginia, George's legacy was immediately recognized. He was revered in his home state as a chief author of its rights and constitution. A large state university, George Mason University, today bears his name, educating thousands with the values of freedom and inquiry he held dear. The Virginia Capitol at Richmond houses a portrait of Mason, and in 1909, the state donated a statue of him to the U.S. Capitol's Statuary Hall. However, nationally, Mason's fame remained modest. It wasn't until 2002 that Washington, D.C. unveiled the George Mason Memorial, a quiet monument near the tidal basin, featuring Mason seated on a bench, with bronze of his 1776 Declaration of Rights. This memorial, though far less visited than those of Washington or Jefferson, finally gave Mason a physical place of honor among the Capitol's many monuments. It symbolically asserts that Mason's contributions are foundational to American liberty, even if his face is not on any currency or Mount Rushmore. For casual fans of history seeking to know more about the architects of American freedom, his life offers rich insights. He was a gentleman farmer who became a revolutionary philosopher when liberty was threatened, a lawmaker who never lost sight of the common good, and a patriot who preferred to be right rather than popular. His legacy lives on every time Americans invoke their fundamental rights, often without realizing that a forgotten founder helped make those rights a reality. Thanks for listening in on our journey into the fascinating life of George Mason. Join us next time as we consider another of our country's greatest treasures, here on American Legacies. See you then. Living amid slavery, George came to see it as not only morally wrong, but as a grave societal danger. In 1765, during the Stamp Act protests, he wrote a pamphlet that, while addressing taxation, also included a protest against the slave trade, one of the earliest such protests on American soil. He blamed the British Crown for hindering Virginia's attempts to restrict the importation of slaves, pointing out that a society too dependent on slave labor would suffer in character and security. His private correspondence in the 1770s shows even more candid fury at the institution. In one 1773 essay, George described slavery as that slow poison which degrades master and slave alike. He believed that holding absolute power over others corrupted the morals of the masters and destroyed their virtue, drawing a lesson from ancient Rome's decline as a warning. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, he carried this theme forward. During debate, he delivered an impassioned oration against the slave trade, condemning it as diabolical and insisting that it weakened and endangered the nation. He argued that slavery discourages arts and manufactures. The poor despise labor when performed by slaves. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. According to notes from the convention, he warned that Providence punishes national sins by national calamities, implying that America would suffer divine retribution if it did not eliminate slavery. George's legacy is woven into the very fabric of American liberty. Although he never held national office or sought personal glory, the principles he championed have had enduring influence. Here are some of the most important takeaways from Mason's life and contributions. His insistence on a written guarantee of fundamental rights directly paved the way for the U.S. Bill of Rights. He wrote America's first Bill of Rights and refused to accept a constitution without one. Every American today enjoys freedoms, speech, religion, jury trial, etc., that George fought to secure. He has rightly been called the father of the Bill of Rights for this legacy, even if the term isn't as widely known as father of the Constitution for Madison. His Virginia Declaration of Rights also helped set a global precedent for enshrining human rights in founding documents. He played a behind-the-scenes mentorship role to other luminaries. Jefferson, Madison, and others drew on his knowledge and looked up to him. He was essentially a teacher of Republican philosophy while remaining a private citizen much of his life. His humility and not coveting fame contributed to his being less remembered, but as a result, Mason's story teaches us about the unsung architects of change, those whose ideas might be adopted by others who get the credit. In Virginia, George's legacy was immediately recognized. He was revered in his home state as a chief author of its rights and constitution. A large state university, George Mason University, today bears his name, educating thousands with the values of freedom and inquiry he held dear. The Virginia Capitol at Richmond houses a portrait of Mason, and in 1909 the state donated a statue of him to the U.S. Capitol's Statuary Hall. However, nationally, Mason's fame remained modest. It wasn't until 2002 that Washington, D.C. unveiled the George Mason Memorial, a quiet monument near the tidal basin, featuring Mason seated on a bench with bronze of his 1776 Declaration of Rights. This memorial, though far less visited than those of Washington or Jefferson, finally gave Mason a physical place of honor among the Capitol's many monuments. It symbolically asserts that Mason's contributions are foundational to American liberty, even if his face is not on any currency or Mount Rushmore. For casual fans of history seeking to know more about the architects of American freedom, his life offers rich insights. He was a gentleman farmer who became a revolutionary philosopher when liberty was threatened, a lawmaker who never lost sight of the common good, and a patriot who preferred to be right rather than popular. His legacy lives on every time Americans invoke their fundamental rights, often without realizing that a forgotten founder helped make those rights a reality. Thanks for listening in on our journey into the fascinating life of George Mason. Join us next time as we consider another of our country's greatest treasures here on American Legacies. See you then.